Hello everyone. The topic that our presentation is going to cover is going to be the genre of historical fiction. As you can see, there are a few different ways that the genre can be defined, and different publishers or genre associations will each have their own interpretation of what works they would consider to be part of the genre. In general, it's important that the events that take place within the work happen at least 50 years before the work is actually published, or else occurred during the author's early childhood or sometime they don't actively remember. The most important part of this is that in order to get the sense of the time, place, and culture of the historical period that the work is taking place in, the author would be acting more from a place of research, a lot of careful study into the time period from artifacts, documents, and possibly the recollections of all other older people who do have actual memories of those time periods, rather than the author's own personal memories and experiences. As you can imagine, this makes the genre very broad, as well as a very old genre, since many old tales do relate to previous and even older time periods. This gives us many popular historical figures, such as King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, of course, as part of the mythology, as well as even fictional characters such as Beowulf, that still come from very old time periods, but were told much later on as more of a recollection of the past, whether fictionalized or attempting to be somewhat truthful. There are four major characteristics of the historical fiction genre. The first is just the wealth of historical details, either specific to certain characters, the events that the story takes place during, or even just the setting, the geography, and making the setting really come alive to the reader, since that's one of the major appeals is understanding and sort of experiencing a time and culture and place that isn't the reader's own. The second major characteristic of the genre is authenticity. That's very important because if you're going to set the work during a time period, readers do expect you to actually be somewhat truthful. You can't really put a book in a time period and then have everything be from another time period or even just a culture that wouldn't have fit with the setting you put the story into. There's always a place for comic versions, of course, but in general, those portrayals aren't really well accepted by readers. The third major characteristic of the genre is the storylines of the works themselves. In general, the characters are more important than the actual plot. Readers care a bit more about how the culture, the time period, the values of the time affect the characterization and what kind of development the character goes through, to see perspectives different from what you would in the contemporary time period. And since this is one of the larger appeals, the actual specific plot line doesn't really matter as much as the having powerful and well-developed characters as a central focus. The fourth major element is pacing. One of the big draws of a historical fiction novel is the history, and in order to get those kinds of details and to really immerse the reader in that kind of setting, it's important to have a slower, better paced novel that can really get the details out, that allow the reader to have a bit more time rather than rushing them through and blowing by a lot of the setting details, since those are what you would really read these kinds of books for in the first place. While historical fiction can really be considered to go back to even ancient times, our modern understanding of the genre could probably be traced to Sir Walter Scott, with his works such as Ivanhoe, which have become incredibly famous, and have really portrayed tales such as Robin Hood and King Richard as more literary figures rather than just the historical figures that they may have been based on. And of course, his works were followed by such authors as Dorothy Dunnett, Howard Fast, Murray Renault, and Irving Stone, as well as many other authors, even continuing today. The benchmark authors of the 21st century in many ways resemble those of the 20th century as far as covering many of the same time frames. As always, the Middle Ages, Renaissance, as well as the ancient world with cultures such as Greece, Rome, and ancient Egypt have all remained very popular settings to use. Additionally, many works within the genre follow a very similar style or story structure. It's always been popular to arrange books into sweeping sagas, like many ancient texts would have been written in, such as Viking Eddas. And additionally, historical romance has been a pretty consistently popular genre from the 20th century onward. Additionally, adventure has been a very popular genre to mix with historical fiction, since historical time periods allow for a much more believable sense of adventure due to a lot of the world being unexplored, or generally there being more mystery to things than many people would consider in the modern era. Of course, one of the major differences is that by the 21st century authors, they're looking at history from a very modern lens, and would be actually very different than the 20th century authors just due to the different archaeological discoveries and reinterpretations of history due to movements like the civil rights movement, which have shifted people's perspective on a lot of aspects of culture and really give a different sort of spin to many aspects of history. Due to characterization mattering a lot more than the specific plots of many historical fiction novels, there aren't really all that many clearly defined subgenres of the historical fiction genre. In general, the breakdown is usually more by the time period which the story takes place in. Things like the ancient civilizations, medieval eras, aspects like the American Revolution or Civil War stories, the World Wars, and of course many, many more, not only depending on the time period, but also the specific setting. For subgenres broken down more by the actual subject of the story itself, there are a few different types of stories which do tend to appear. These can be defined as alternate histories, fictional biographies, and historical romance, among a couple of others. The subgenre of alternate history are stories that speculate on the topics such as the nature of time, the linearity of time, and the link between the past and the present, as well as the role of specific individuals in shaping or reshaping history. This isn't really the same as time travel, it's also more of a speculation that if a specific individual had made a different choice at a certain point in time, it would be speculating how history would have changed as a result of that choice. 1995 can be seen as the year the genre really came into its own. One of the extremely popular and widespread forms of alternate history are different looks at scenarios where the Nazis won World War II, or alternatively, where the Russians won the Cold War. It remains very popular since it's somewhat seen as very world changing in general. It isn't the same as changing the fate of a single country. It's seen as something that really shapes the entire world as a result of that win. So it's been a very popular subject that allows people to speculate. Unlike other areas of historical fiction, these books do tend to be based more on the specific plot, just due to the nature of this particular subgenre. So the appeals factor here would be things like a fast-driven plot and a faster pacing that really puts a sense of urgency and thrill that isn't really found in many other areas of historical fiction. Another popular subgenre that's also very widespread is what is termed nautical fiction or possibly maritime fiction. Generally, it's stories set on the ocean, either specific individuals, perhaps taking multiple ships on a journey, or the story of a specific ship and its crew either on a single journey or a set of journeys. Stories such as Sinbad the Sailor would kind of fall into this genre. The genre is sometimes called pirate fiction due to, well, many stories being actually centered around pirates, especially in the wake of the novel Treasure Island, which really set the tone for stories about pirates and buried treasure and many other aspects associated with what we call pirate lore these days. Another more specific subgenre is military naval fiction. These follow famous ships, naval officers, or ocean battles, and give a fictionalized portrayal of the lives of these officers or the crew, or really the effects of the battle itself in history. One of the appeals factors for nautical fiction is that the stories are very dramatic. They tend to have larger than life figures such as Big bombastic pirate captains or naval captains in the Royal Navies. They also tend to be filled with jargon not found in other genres or subgenres of history just due to all the ship terms. The stories in general are richly detailed, either in the settings or in just how sailing actually works. And many of them tend to be rather complex, often following stories of betrayal, intrigue, that other specific subgenres may not choose to follow. A more specific subgenre of historical fiction is what's called Jiraigeki, which is Japanese for period piece, and refers to stories mostly in Japanese media, which are set before the Meiji Restoration, which was the fall of the shogun and the samurai as a class, and the rapid modernization of Japan into the modern state we know today. While this subgenre is Japanese in origin, it has many powerful influences on Western fiction, with works such as Star Wars, which many people would actually identify as being largely a samurai film that happens to be set in space. Additionally, the movies of Akira Kurosawa have actually translated very well into other genres, such as The Seven Samurai being readapted into The Magnificent Seven, shifting from samurai to cowboys while keeping almost the exact same plot. The most popular eras of history for these stories to be set in would be the Sengoku period, which is Japan's Warring States era, where many of the most famous samurai in history are from, which serve as Japan's larger-than-life, well-known figures, and somewhat folk heroes and other people who weren't samurai but contributed to the general mystique of that era. The other major period is the Edo period, which followed directly after, once the warring kingdoms were reunited, and it was the era where the samurai had the most direct control. It's another era of many famous samurai, as well as direct power by the samurai in ruling, and enables the use of many different plot lines, such as corrupt shogunates and Japan's dealings with the West, which also make these two genres very popular with Western authors who happen to set their stories in Japan. Some of the appeal factors for this particular subgenre lie mostly in the characters, which are very unique to Japan, such as the samurai, the ronin, which were masterless samurai that often served as wandering swordsmen, the ninja, geisha, sword fights between samurai and duels of honor between families, as well as action and intrigue in the imperial court of Japan and its emperor.